Welcome back. We will now begin the second session on the theme Gender and International Human Rights Discourses. The session will be chaired by Dr. Saumya Uma, Associate Professor, Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat. The first speaker of the panel, Dr. Shubra Nagalia, has unfortunately will not be able to join us as she has taken ill. Our second speaker, the next speaker would be Professor Asha Hans, former professor, Political Science and Women's Studies, Utkal University, Bhubaneshwar, will be speaking on women, peace and security, fulfilling the mandate of UNSCR 1325. And the next speaker, Dr. Oishik Sircar, Associate Professor, Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat, will be speaking on framing the Pharmakon, dilemmas and double binds in the post-colonial feminist engagements in the human rights, in the international human rights law. This will be followed by discussion and a Q&A session. I would take this opportunity to mention some house rules. All the speakers and panelists are requested to mute themselves when not speaking. Questions will be taken during discussion and Q&A session. Panelists can ask questions to the speakers live through a raise hand option. Questions can also be asked by registered attendees by typing through chat box. These will be visible to all the panelists. Questions may be kept brief and to the point. In case you are facing connectivity issues, you may switch off the camera and continue in audio mode. Now I would request Dr. Saumya Uma to kindly conduct the proceedings. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Ankita Datta. Welcome to this second session, and I start with thanking the organizers, the South Asian University, and the Indian Council of World Affairs for this opportunity. Today's topic, this particular session's topic it is Gender and International Human Rights Discourses. So as the chair of this session, I will just lay down a few of the challenges, the dilemmas, some of the context, and the larger framework for this session. The topic reads as Gender and International Human Rights Discourses. So it is not only women as biological entities, but also in terms of social constructs and gender relations that have shaped women as they are today biologically and socially. And of course, we are looking not only as women, although primarily the focus is on women. The title also tells us that it is about international human rights discourses in the plural. So, of course, there are multiple discourses, multiple approaches, and that's what provides for a very interesting and enriching debate and deliberations that we have. This morning, which was on gender and international relations, that very smoothly actually flows into this particular session. It has discussed on feminism, on feminist critiques of international standards, on women as peacemakers, on role of boys and men. So many of these aspects have been touched upon and discussed in the previous session. Those aspects also flow into this particular session, and they are relevant for this particular session as well. And then we take the conversation forward in this session on international human rights discourses and how do we locate gender and what is the relationship and how do we engage with it when we look at it through a gender perspective. Now, human rights discourse in India, in a sense, has been much more institution-centric than people-centric. We have tended to invest a lot of our collective energy, efforts, hopes in institutions. So we created the National Human Rights Commission, the State Human Rights Commissions, the National Commission for Women, the State Commissions, the Minority Commissions, and also the protection commissions for protection of child rights, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, right to information, both at the national level and the state levels. Additionally, we created human rights courts, at least on paper. We also have many all-women's police stations to combat violence against women across different states. We have special courts, we have commissions of inquiry, which are set up from time to time to examine mass crimes, including communal and caste-based violence. Now, despite all of this, human rights in India is in a dismal situation, and women's human rights is even more so. And the latest, of course, that we just cannot forget is the Hathras incident of gang rape and the aftermath that followed from that. So, one reason for this could be by looking at it through a post colonial lens, and by saying that the human rights discourse in India is rooted in very colonial civilizing mission, in which you have a victim, you have a savage who is the violator, and you have the savior who was the British Raj at that time. Post-colonial human rights discourse has also carried these particular metaphors. And so we have the victim in the case of women's human rights. We have woman as the victim. We have the violator, who is very often a state actor, but sometimes is also a non-state actor. And then we have a savior, which is again a state entity. Now, how do we extricate human rights discourse in relation to women from this particular rhetoric of victim, savage, and savior? And how do we make it applicable to everyday lives of women? So this is something that needs examination. The history of international human rights discourse indicates that it responds and redresses to past, present, and future violations, and future violations by setting certain normative standards. To an extent, it is able to, or it is supposed to, anticipate the kind of human rights violations that may happen in future, and to be able to set standards to prevent that, or work in a proactive manner to redress it once those violations happen. Now, who are these actors that we are talking about? Conventionally, of course, in international human rights discourse perspective, the actors are the state as the subject of human rights, particularly in post-World War II context. We see state as a potential violator, so states' powers need to be kept in check so that human rights are not trampled upon. But paradoxically, state is also conceived of as the guarantor of human rights. So, state obligation, for example, in international human rights discourse, talks about obligation to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights, all of which is on the state. Now, feminist critique of the state recognizes this dilemma of state as the violator and state as the protector or the guarantor of human rights. So, women's movements in India have critiqued states' accumulation of power, yet they do not reject the state, but they engage with the state for law reform, for providing justice through courts of law, for effective implementation of existing laws. So both with all the organs of the state, so with the executive, with the judiciary, and the legislature, the women's movements in India have been engaging. Similarly, despite a feminist critique of international human rights discourse and the regime of human rights institutions at the international level, feminists have not failed to engage with international human rights institutions or mechanisms, or to make use of normative standards to further women's human rights in India. So some examples are, of course, women's movements engagements with the CEDAW Committee for Alternative Reports, in the Universal Periodic Review. So there is a large number of women's organizations and groups which participate in the UPR process, also submitting reports to the UN Special Rapporteurs on violence against women, on human rights defenders, on enforced disappearances, on torture. Also, in terms of legal advocacy initiatives like the Communal Violence Bill, There are international human rights standards which are used in law reform campaigns, again, like the PWDVA, which is the Domestic Violence Act. You have the international human rights standards which are used. So we see that feminists in India have both critiqued the international human rights discourse and also engaged with the international human rights standards and institutions. Now, today, the challenge before us, I'm just laying it down as 5 points, and some of this will be addressed by our two very eminent speakers for this session. So, the first challenge is, how do we root human rights discourse both in local cultures and discourses as well as in internationalism? Second, to implement and give life to the human rights standards at the grassroots level. How do we deal with this paradox of the government of India ratifying the International Human Rights Conventions at one hand, and yet on the ground level, violence and discrimination against women continue to exist? So how do we deal with that? And this violence and discrimination is not only against women, but also against many other genders as well. We see the transgender bill, which trampled upon some of the very progressive or very positive rights which were given by the courts themselves. The third challenge before us is that today the subject of human rights discourse is no longer state actors alone. It is non-state actors, and it is outfits including the multinational corporate houses. So given today's neoliberal context in India and the shrinking nature of welfare state, the challenge is to use traditional international human rights standards towards non-state actors and entities, and this includes violations by corporate houses as well as in caste-based or communal violence situations where the actors are not only state actors but also non-state actors. The fourth challenge before us is the appropriation of human rights language by non-state actors, including business enterprises, where the human rights of individuals and the human rights of communities are pitted against the human rights of corporate houses themselves. What are its impacts for women? For example, what are its impacts in garment industries, which are a site of extreme violation of human rights? The fifth and the last challenge that I'm flagging is the concept of universalism, where universalism is a normative value on which international human rights discourse is premised, and feminists have engaged with the notion of universalism differently. While it has its usefulness in terms of rejecting justification or violation of human rights on grounds of religion, culture, customs, and traditions, a post-colonial critique of universalism also exists. So how can feminists reclaim universalism in international human rights discourse in order to further women's rights, even while being rooted in the local culture? So these are some of the challenges before us, and we have two very eminent speakers before us, Professor Asha Hans and Professor Oishik Sircar, and they will be addressing some of these challenges. So over to Professor Asha Hans. I invite Professor Asha Hans to start her presentation, which is on 1325. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. It's a privilege to be here today, and I'm thankful to both ICWA and the South Asia University, because especially ICWA, I have a long history. At a time when we were students at JNU, the first library we went to was in Sapro House. And you could always see ICWA people, including Dr. Kunzu, walk up and down the library. So it's been a long time. But all these issues that you talked about, Uma, when I look at 1325 and I see the kind of misnomers there are usually that when you talk of international relations, it has nothing to do with the local. It has nothing to do with people. It's more states, it's territory. These are the kind of issues that we are looking at most of the time. But now when we look at 1325 from a different perspective, having gone deep into it and trying to see why states are not recognizing it, including India, which has not acknowledged it, then you know that there is something that we need to do a bit more of explanation, and we don't talk about it in India. That is one of the things. Very rarely do people talk about issues like 1325. It's out of even the International Women Peace and Security Agenda. Very, very rarely. Now, this year is very important as unfortunately, I didn't hear this morning because the other lectures, since I had another meeting. But most of us know that this year was very important till COVID hit us. And this was the 25th year of Beijing, it's the 75th year of the United Nations, and it's also the 20th year of 1325. So there are so many markers where women have come forward and tried to get for me is most important is how do you bring in peace and security agenda within a country in South Asia, globally also. Because this is one place where women have been left out, and 1325 tries to mend that by bringing women into the agenda. Now, it's not a new thing, even in India, because I remember one of the persons whom we worked with very closely was a member of parliament, Nirmala Deshpande, who did tremendous work on peace and security. In fact, to the extent that even when she was, people used to criticize her for talking about Pakistan. It was not like this as it is now, but there was always some kind of critique at the back. But she had finally her ashes also immersed in the Indus River. So, she took peace to that extent where women were concerned, especially, and bringing women in. So there were people like her. She was a tremendous writer. She wrote on the Chinese cultural ethos. There were books that she had written on. I remember one of the most famous one was called Seaman. So, people knew that she was a writer, she was a member of parliament, her voice counted. But usually where peace and security are concerned, our voices are very rarely heard because there is a different kind of approach to peace and security in South Asia. Now, why women, peace and security and 1325? I think one of the major point that I would consider would be that during war, women are the hard targets. I remember talking to a foreign secretary once and he said, "What are you working on?" So I told him this on women, peace and security. He said, "Oh, I do. This is a soft thing that you're working on, idea." So I said, "Yes, but soft ideas sometimes do matter because women are hard targets in the soft policy that we follow." So, he said, "Yes, I agree with you and I think that we need to do much more." So where women are concerned as hard targets, I think does make a difference. It also came at a time when, if any of you remember Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was a heart-rendering issue that came up at that time. That because of the change in ethnicity that was wanted, women were made pregnant so that 5 months they could not see a doctor and not get an abortion. And so the ethnicity would change. So forced pregnancies during the Japanese, even till now, where the American bases are concerned, but there was earlier during the Japanese when bases were there, that women were always the targets. There was sex slavery. So when during conflict you go to that extent, where women are forced not to have an abortion when they want to, when women are are sex slaves for years and years to come, and policies of government support that. So that was the major thing that happened, that these issues we thought that needed to be changed. It was in the 1990s, especially most of you have been, I'm sure, to the Commission of Status of Women. It was not a Western thing. It was the African women from Rwanda. Remember, that was the age of not only Bosnia, but it was also Rwanda that happened. It was Somalia. All these countries were in Africa where there was so much of conflict that they brought the issue and said that we need to take it to the Security Council. That has become a major contention. Why did people go to the Security Council and not to the General Assembly? And that is something maybe we can discuss later, but that is an issue that arose, and people chose that where security is concerned, the major perpetrators are those in the Security Council. So if we have to talk with anyone, it is they whom we need to talk to. So that became a major reason. But 1325 was not only conflict zones. Conflict, it was also an electoral politics. That if women are not decision makers, they don't decide war and peace, then it is also because in electoral politics, they don't find any space. If you look at India today in Parliament, see the number of seats that women have, I think it's about 14%. So the small number of women who get into electoral politics, that was an issue of 1325. So it's not peace and security and international relations which you are talking about in a broad pattern, which we don't come down to earth. It was that. There was also the major, of course, was that women lack voice in decision, in any kind of peacemaking, in any kind of issue, whether peace is within the house or whether peace is within the community or in the panchayats, women lack that voice. So that is why 1325 came, and patriarchy was the central point that they talked about, that it is not individuals who are patriarchs, it's also the state, because patriarchy is power and control. And if the state has that, then it is they who control the women and do not give voice to the women. The aim was not only resolving conflict, but to do away with war. I think that was the major issue that was there then, and still continues to be with the people who promoted it. But they said one thing which still matters, and what Uma was talking about, that security was the well-being of women. It didn't talk about security just of not being killed or not or being sexually abused. They talked about the well-being of women, which became the second most important factor in 1325. So it was on 8th of March in 2000 that Anwarul Chowdhury, the ambassador to Bangladesh, talked about women not being included. And as part of that discussion that had been going on with women in the Peace Caucus on 31st of October, we're just coming to the 20th year, that 1325 was announced. There were 4 pillars to it: participation, prevention, protection, relief, and recovery. Now, participation, as I said, was not only peace, it was also electoral processes. The prevention of conflict was addressing the root causes. That is something that men have been talking about for so long, that what are the root causes? International relations, academics, I have done work on that. All of us at some time or the other. But it was something that was difficult for women to follow within 1325. But one issue that they talked about was that peace is based on equality. So they were talking about equality between men and women, while Beijing in 1995 had promoted that. In 1325, again, it became one of the major pillars of participation of women, that if there is participation, it should be on equality. The second issue was, of course, protection in conflict, but also post-conflict situation. If the conflict is over, like it happened in Nepal, and then the other issue was today that has become very important, is relief and recovery. I think if you are going to look at COVID, you also need to look at 1325 and see what 1325 has to offer, because it talks of humanitarian services. It talks about trauma and counseling, where women are concerned in war, in peace situations, and so now also in humanitarian issues also. At the moment, every 1325 country that has to that agrees to it has to bring about a national action plan. 86 countries have agreed to a national action plan, which is about, I think, 45 to 50% of the countries. That are 45 maybe. But the budget is only there of only 28 countries. So you agree to 1325, you say that you will, you acknowledge it and you will implement it, but you do not have the budget. So that has been a major reason. In South Asia, Bangladesh and Nepal have signed it. The other countries have not. Afghanistan, if you take it in that way, Afghanistan also is one of the countries that has signed this. There are also 9 sister resolutions. And what this morning we were talking, I heard the last part of what Samita was saying, that about, and Lakshmi, that men and boys also should be included. So the 9 resolutions that came after were on violence. They talked about the indicators. They talked about of raising funds, more funding, and they talked about inclusion of men and boys. So these 9, the sister resolutions that are there, most of the people who promoted it think that it is that they have diluted the cause of 1325, because 1325 was meant to do away with war. But I think war also, there are many reasons. There are reasons for resources. There are so many other reasons that are there. India has agreed to implement it not internally. We do not want it. In fact, some people had done some work on Northeast. We do not want to bring in Kashmir and as well as Northeast. But they have agreed to implement it externally, not signing 1325, not agreeing to it, but saying that they would provide where women peacekeeping forces are concerned. If you remember, the first all women peacekeeping forces in Liberia in 2007, and then they have done training. But they have still, so in South Asia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India still have not signed it. And the implementation is very broad. Liberia, when it signed it, talked about empowerment of women's land resources. So that is what Umali was saying about peace. Peace is not only not picking up the gun, and it is much more. It is on land resources. Ireland talked about the capacity of civil society to build that up and gender-based violence. And the third is of Ghana, which talked about displacement and repatriation. Uganda went to the extent of bringing health in it, that access to health women should have. But why women who promoted it are not satisfied? About it. Because talking to one of them, I was told recently that where 1325 is concerned, it does not make war safe for women. That is by bringing in women in the peacekeeping forces, but do away with war, because you may not be in a war zone but live in a war system. The system itself is like that. It is conflictual. And people do not, according to them, emphasize on prevention. The only thing you talk about is protection, which other also resolutions bring about, and do not address the root causes of conflict. Now, there are new types of, how much minutes do I have, Uma? I can't hear.
Ma'am, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think another 5 to 7 minutes.
5 minutes, fine. So there are new types of conflict that we have seen on resources. Water, for instance, that I worked on between countries, within countries, is a major conflict. trade is a major conflict, terrorism, which is also. So there are new types of conflicts. Can 1325 deal with those kind of issues is something theoretically we need to raise, and people are raising. So people have started to work in different ways. If countries are not agreeing to it, there are also now called what are called as local action plans that you deal with 1325 peace and security at a local level. In Colombia, there has been mass involvement of the mayors, etc., where 1325 is concerned, and they have agreed and done that. I think some people tried it in Northeast in India, but in India it's something that does not work. It's not easy to do it. But some of us are promoting what is called a People's Action Plan. We are saying if the government is not going to come forward, then maybe it is time that a People's Action Plan is formulated where women should promote at each state a level of governance. It is not only, it's not peace and security that you are going to sit at only at the peace negotiation, but to do away with conflict, you have to start from your home to the community and go up above. So this People's Action Plan is something that we have been promoting for the last 2-3 years. Because we need an alternative system to war. We need an alternative system to the kind of conflict that is there. And that has to be done at each level of governance. Because it is something that people have to be involved in. And we look at then security in a very different way. We look at security as a human security. And human security, theoretically, we've developed some indicators, and these include basic needs, environment protection, dignity, and physical and psychological violence. These are the 4 indicators of human security. And we feel that if you want 1325, these are the 4 that should be part of 1325. And I would suggest for those who are teachers here, who are doing with peace studies, use the People's Action Plan, the local action plans, and 1325 as a simulation in your courses that you are teaching. Maybe that would help. We need a group of concerned people to come together. And as a friend said, if the landmine treaty could be done by 2 women sitting on a kitchen table, it can be done. 1325 can come about with so many of us who are here today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Asha Hans, for speaking about a very important aspect that's on women, peace, and security, and not only spelling out what it is about, but also the aspects related to implementation and the challenges before us, and what we can do and how we can use People's Action Plan, for example, to take the process forward in terms of implementing 1325 at the local level, even if the governments do not do that. Should we, since the 2 speakers' topics are quite different in a sense, is it okay if we take some questions now and then move on to the next speaker? Can we do that?
I don't see any questions as of yet.
Okay.
If we can just move on to the next speaker, and then we'll see.
Okay, and then take questions. Okay, fine. Okay, so I invite Professor Oishik Sircar to speak on the topic of on the topic of framing the Pharmakon dilemmas and double binds in post-colonial feminist engagements with international human rights law. I think that although Dr. Ankita did introduce both the speakers. I think I have before me their more detailed bio notes, and since we do have the time, let me read it out both for Professor Asha Hans, which I didn't, and let me also read it out for Professor Oishik Sircar. So, Professor Asha Hans is a director of Development Research Institute, and she is member board of UN Women Peace Humanitarian Fund. She's a professor emerita of political science and founder director of School of Women Studies in Utkal University. She is a recent co-chair of Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. Her recent publications on gender, peace, and security are Betty Reardon and Asha Hans 2019, titled The Gender Imperative, Human Security versus State Security. It's a Rutledge publication. And one of her other books, which has been very well received and very well known, is co-edited by Asha Hans and Swarna Rajagopalan in 2016, and it's titled Openings for Peace, UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women and Security in India. That was a SAGE publication. And she has written extensively on women and climate change. Her forthcoming book is called Engendering Climate Change, Learnings from South Asia. So we have heard Professor Asha Hans, and we understand, the decades of experience and expertise with which she has spoken on women, peace, and security. Now, I would also introduce more fully Dr. Oishik Sircar, although Dr. Ankita has introduced him. Dr. Oishik Sircar is an associate professor at the Jindal Global Law School and associate member at the Institute for International Law and Humanities in the Melbourne Law School. He is the co-editor of New Intimacies, Old Desires, Law, Culture and Queer Politics in Neoliberal Times. It's a Zuban publication of 2017. He's also the author of Violent Modernities, Cultural Lives of Law in the New India. It's an Oxford publication of 2020. Oishik's co-directed documentary film, We Are Foot Soldiers, produced in 2010 on the activism of children of sex workers in Calcutta, won the third prize at the Jivika Asia Livelihoods Film Festival. In an earlier life, Oishik has worked as human rights lawyer, campaigner, and educator with Amnesty International, the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center, and the Center for Communication and Development Studies. So I welcome Oishik, and I request him to start his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Saumya. I feel somewhat like an interloper here, not least because I don't work in the area of international relations, but in fact because Ankita's invitation to be a part of this panel, offered me to go back to work that I used to do earlier and have not, revisited in a long time. I don't do human rights work anymore. Neither do I teach human rights law. So thank you for that opportunity, though it might not necessarily live up to the rigor of the nature of engagement that Professor Asha Hans's presentation demonstrated with regard to 1325. But I'll try. And I'm particularly glad to see several familiar faces who have met at different times, which of course include people who've been in a position of mentoring me, including Saumya when I was a law student, several years back. So it's good to be in the company of known faces. The title of my presentation is quite a mouthful, so I'm not going to repeat it again. What I'm going to do is hold on to 3 words from the title and offer some contingent sense of the way in which I'm going to use them in what I have to say. So that'll be the first part of the presentation. In the second part of the presentation, I am going to illustrate the argument that I want to advance, holding on to 3 ways of thinking about what I'm calling double binds. So the 3 words that I want to hold on to are 1, postcolonial, 2nd, Pharmakon, and 3rd, double bind. Please understand that these words are conceptually heavy, and I am going to end up offering an impoverished understanding of them in this short period of time. But so please treat them as a contingent way of making sense of what they mean for my purposes. So the word postcolonial, I use that word, as a single word, not as a word which is hyphenated. So the post and the colonial are not hyphenated for me. The reason for the absence of the hyphen in the way I understand it is to not think of it as a clean break between colonialism and what comes after. I want to think about the word in the form of thinking about continuities, rather than a linear progression from a before period to a later period. And the reason for doing that is to consider the postcolonial present as one that is hybrid, that doesn't necessarily hark back to imaginations of a pure past. And in a certain sense, the subjectivities that those who inhabit the postcolonial condition carry is subjectivities that are mongrelized, in the sense that there is no pure sense of identity that we can claim when we inhabit the postcolonial present, as it were. So that's the contingent way I want to think about the word postcolonial. The second word is the word Pharmakon. And it has it's a pretty old word. One can trace it back to Plato's Pharmacy, to the way in which Jacques Derrida thought about the word in his commentary on Plato's Pharmacy, and much later in the postcolonial context, the way in which Gayatri Spivak kind of brings it into her writings. The simple way, if there is one at all, in which I want to hold on to the word Pharmakon is something that suggests, an idea or a concept or a thing that is medicine and poison at the same time. And there's a third meaning that is sometimes attributed to go along the fact that it is medicine and poison, is that it is also a certain kind of scapegoat figure. And I'm not going to attend to that scapegoat understanding of Pharmakon, but we will see that how human rights discourses, or the idea of human rights, is sometimes turned into a scapegoat. But for the moment, I want to think about human rights in the liberal sense in which we understand it as both medicine and poison at the same time. You cannot dissociate the remedy from the cure. And this takes me to the third term that I want to use, is the word double bind. The fact that something is simultaneously a remedy and a cure is what is suggested by the word double bind. If you want to think about the word double bind in the sense of in the sense of the way in which, for example, it attends to the postcolonial condition or our engagement with international law, international human rights law specifically, we might think of it as something that produces a situation where we'll have to live with contradictory inheritances. where you cannot dissociate one inheritance from another inheritance. And in Gayatri Spivak's words, there's a particularly evocative phrase that she uses to characterize liberal human rights as Pharmakon-like, where she says that it is that which we cannot not want. It is something that we cannot not want despite knowing its racist or imperialist origins. And the way I want to think about international human rights law here, in the way in which I characterize it as a double bind, is where rights do two things at the same time. They both emancipate and regulate. So the emancipatory potential is the medicine, the regulatory potential is the poison. So that was the first part, giving you some contingent sense of the three words that broadly frame what is to come later. What I'm going to do now in the second part is to offer three illustrations of double binds. Now, these illustrations pertain to three ways in which postcolonial feminisms have engaged with international human rights law. These are spread over a pretty broad period of time, but I'm not going to temporally locate them or give them a specific temporal kind of pinpoint. The reason for that being that while they emerge at a particular period of time, we do see traces of each of these dilemmas or double binds present in the way in which even current debates around feminism and international human rights law are playing out. So the first illustration is what I am calling NGOized feminism. And in a certain sense, the way in which women's international human rights concerns gain prominence at the world stage is through not merely through the way in which women's solidarity movements worked, but the way in which women's solidarity movements in fact fed into non-state actors who then carried their voices to international human rights institutions. So what I have in mind here are institutions like, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch specifically. And one of the things, if anybody kind of goes through the archive of HRW or AI over the last 20 years or 30 years or so, particularly post the Vienna Tribunal on women's human rights, you will see that a majority of the reports on women's human rights are focused on sexual rights, violations, sexual violence on women in parts of the world that we could call the third or the global south, for example. And what this has resulted in over a period of time is, of course, an identification of international human rights law work by groups like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch that use Orientalist tropes to visibilize the kind of violence that women face. So this is not to say that the violence does not take place. This is not to say that the violence is not deserving of attention, but that the visibilization of a particular kind of violence requires the application of a certain kind of trope, and that trope is Orientalist in nature. And what that trope ends up doing, and this is the point that Saumya made a reference to, it produces women figures who are at the receiving end of that violence as victim figures. And the fact that HRW or AI could do this was something that was already set in motion with the Vienna Tribunal on women's human rights in 1993. If one actually looks to the archives of the testimonies of the 1993 tribunal, there are also testimonies that are recorded. There's something fascinating that in fact emerges. What emerges is, one, who were the women who were selected to testify? And if you look at the women who were selected to testify, you'll have a sense of the kind of geographical regions they were representing. So that's one. The second, of course, is if you look at the testimonies, you will actually see that the original testimonies that were written up were much longer than the testimonies that were in fact presented. So they went through an editorial process of bringing the length of the testimony down to, something that can be presented verbally in front of the jury. And in this editorial process, what happened, what each of the testimony resulted in a decontextualized presentation of an experience. So, for example, everybody who spoke just spoke about the experience of sexual violence without any sense of the context in which it took place. So that decontextualized presentation of these testimonies resulted in a singular focus on sexual violence as the most egregious form of violence that women face, resulting in what has been argued a displacing or invisibilization of other kinds of violence that women also have to negotiate. And so the privileging of sexual violence, almost an exceptionalization of sexual violence, is what emerged in the wake of Vienna. Obviously, this resulted in very important developments. For example, the vow declaration that for the first time, defined what vow is, within the UN system. It also responded to the absence of the word violence in CEDAW, for example. So this is not to say that these were unhelpful developments, but this is to say that was the double bind in a certain sense, that what was achieved was also accompanied by a certain kind of exceptionalization of sexual violence and the presentation of women's subjectivity as victim figures. Now, this clearly has helped. We know the way in which this has enabled women's groups in parts of the world without access to the international human rights law system to be able to, build these bridges of communication through shadow reports or the visits of the special rapporteur, so on and so forth. But this has also resulted in something that has especially been a particularly, strong dilemma for, women's rights movement in the global South. This being what, again, Saumya had earlier pointed out, the tension between cultural relativism on the one hand and universalism on the other. The dilemma was not so much about whether these testimonies or the images of victim subjects were necessarily being presented with Orientalist tropes. The dilemma primarily from the local setting was that the opposition to the language of universalism was in fact being led by conservative forces, and one remembers the kind of debate that emerged in the wake of the Asian Values Declaration. And to be caught between universalism and cultural relativism has kind of been a recurrent double bind that one has not been necessarily been able to step out of. In fact, I would think, and this is really a passing remark, that the attempt to reclaim universalism, if at all that's possible, in itself is a double bind. Can it ever be reclaimed? We know that there have been attempts at what Sally Engel Merry has called the vernacularization of international human rights law for application in local contexts, but vernacularization also has been at the receiving end of nativist measures by conservative forces. So that's my first illustration, which is the impact of NGOized feminism and the kind of double binds it has created. My second illustration is what I'm calling critical feminism, and the emergence of critical feminism, in a certain sense, kind of coincides with the emergence of what in law has been referred to as the critical legal studies or the critical legal theory movement. Now, one of the things, and this is, so international human rights law work was taking a leaf out of those debates in critical legal theory. So one of the key questions that critical feminism asked that, turned the discourse of international human rights into one that is a double bind, not merely emancipatory, but also regulatory, is to ask who is the subject of international women's rights law. In other words, the question aimed at challenging the kind of collapse that international human rights law worked with between gender and sex, that it advanced a certain kind of biological essentialist understanding of who is the subject of international women's rights law, and we can see this particular concern dovetailing with the exceptional or singular focus on sexual violence that I discussed in the earlier illustration. Now, this challenge or this question that was posed, was animated through, it started, the questioning kind of started in 1995 in Cairo, at the Cairo conference, and then, carried on until Beijing 2005. And what was at the center of how this got animated was a contestation between reproductive rights on the one hand and sexual rights on the other. So the identity question, who is a woman, in fact, hit at the heart of the heterosexual foundations of the reproductive rights discourse. And every time you had activists trying to raise questions about where does sexual rights feature in the international women's rights agenda, it was either in a more generous sense considered to be a subset of reproductive rights, or in the worst case scenario, what happened at Beijing especially, every time there'll be a meeting for a resolution and somebody will raise the sexuality question, the document that would the draft document that would come out will always have the word sexuality in brackets. In fact, Sealing Cheng has a lovely, piece called Bracketing Sexuality, where she demonstrates how this happened. And what would happen over time once the document would get to the point of being finalized is that every time the word sexuality that appeared in brackets, it would drop off. So sexuality, in fact, dropped off the agenda, in the kind of conversations that happened in Beijing. And it continued that tension, that double bind in a certain sense between reproductive rights and sexual rights, reproductive rights being privileged over sexual rights. Now, the double bind gets even more complicated at that stage because from Cairo to Beijing, a particular kind of representation increased at the conference. So there was such a representation in Cairo, but that representation increased in Beijing. And this was the presence of the evangelical Christian conservative presence. Now, what this resulted in, particularly in Cairo, is an emergence of a particularly strange, solidarity between some women's rights groups and the evangelicals, and it marked a beginning of a tenuous relationship that would continue even today, where we would see that sometimes women's rights and right-wing groups suddenly emerge as strange bedfellows. Not in the context of international human rights law, but I'm particularly reminded of that time, I think in the 90s when the Miss World pageant was being organized in Bangalore, and if you looked at who constituted the protesters outside, it was in fact the Hindu right wing and a group of women's rights groups speaking very different languages, but joined in solidarity against the same event. So it's a complicated relationship there that one could mark the inauguration of it at Beijing. So that's the second illustration, which is critical feminism, which asked a question, this question about who's a woman, resulting in this tension between reproductive rights and sexual rights. The third illustration, which I end with, is what I'm calling Contra Feminism. And what I mean by that is a challenge against feminism itself, or certain strands of feminism itself, and the challenge asking the question or making the assertion that feminism can harm women. And it's a certain kind of challenge that has that emerged in the context of the sex wars in North America, for example. So one can trace that debate back to that time in North America where the sex wars took place with queer theory breaking away from feminist theory. And particularly in the context of law, we see this debate animated particularly in the work of the scholar Janet Haley, who in fact made a declaration that she wants to take a break from feminism, and advanced particularly compelling arguments for why she thinks that is important. Now, this taking a break project that Janet Haley introduces then gets taken up by postcolonial feminist scholars. And one such figure, one such contemporary figure, for example, is Prabha Koteshwaran, who is part, along with Janet Haley, in a project that they call the project of governance feminism, where they advance a critique of what they're calling governance feminism. And by governance feminism, very simply put, they suggest feminism that has started to walk through the halls of power. That feminism, which was traditionally meant to question power, is now hobnobbing with power, is kind of rubbing shoulders with power, and in fact is doing more harm to women in the name of emancipation than what its avowed radical beginnings suggested. And one particular illustration through which governance feminism and Prabha Koteshwaran's work especially has illustrated what feminism has turned into, or a particular strand of feminism has turned into. One would say, even if they don't make it as apparent in their work, I think their challenge is particularly aimed at, the origins of radical feminism and the mutated forms that radical feminism has taken today, particularly in its demand for the abolition of prostitution. And I think that's the site at which the debate on governance feminism is playing out currently, both in the West and in the post-colony. And it's a debate which demonstrates that, abolitionist feminists working closely with states and corporations to advance a vision of women's emancipation, which is actually aimed at denying them agency in the name of protecting them. And so, for example, Prabha Koteshwaran gives it a name. She calls it governance feminism. But the work of Ratna Kapoor, for example, prior to that, has also demonstrated the way in which international human rights legal interventions into the abolition of sex slavery, for example, has in fact resulted in curbing women's right to livelihood and movement in the name of protecting them. So there's a certain kind of paternalism associated in the way in which these interventions work. What we see with the contra-feminist position is an almost seamless coming together of four kinds of actors, I would think. One, feminists, of course, because they are the ones, or a particular strand of feminists, working closely with the religious right, working closely with market capitalism, all joined together with the objective of protecting women. And so in a certain sense, it is this morass that a certain strand of feminism has entered into that, led to somebody like Janet Haley or the Governance Feminist Project, take a stand with regard to the way in which feminism, or a particular kind of feminism, has ended up harming women rather than emancipating them. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Oishik, for your very interesting presentation on where you gave 3 illustrations of double binds. Some of the things that you said They are very provocative, and they are something that that definitely needs more discussion. But as the chair, I don't want to take up much time. So maybe some of what you said, I will kind of also like to give some inputs, if time permits, towards the end of this session. But I think the three illustrations that you have given, they are very interesting, and you have drawn upon the international human rights context. You've looked at the impact of NGOized feminism, critical feminism, as well as contra feminism. Of course, the whole aspect of governance feminism and how it applies to India, whether it applies to India and how it applies to India, is something that is quite a bit a subject of debate and deliberation. In the course, I teach an elective course which is called Feminists in Action, women's movements and legal advocacy initiatives. So as part of that, one aspect that we do discuss is about governance feminism. So we do read Prabha Koteshwaran's work. We also have this critique of by Haley, and there's been a very interesting discussion on whether or not one can say that governance feminism is really something that the Indian feminists, for example, can you explain that in terms of the criminal law reforms that came in 2013 in the post Jyoti Pandey, homicidal gang rape case. So that's been, and to what extent then are we able to relate that to the international human rights discourse is something that's again very interesting and calls for some discussion. Let me take up the questions, and I will ask the questions. So one of the questions which is addressed to Professor Asha Hans, and this is by Professor Vibhuti Patel. She says, in the context of Rohingya refugee crisis, ethnic tension in Sri Lanka, and unrest in northeast India and Kashmir, how effective is 1325 for peacemaking and peace building? So can we, there are other questions, but maybe Professor Asha Hans can first take this up. It's now 3:08. We have around 22 minutes because this session has to be completed at 3:30. So we have around 22 minutes. So maybe about 7 minutes per speaker for the responses. So this is one question. Let me also read out this other question, which is a question to Professor Asha Hans that I have posed. What is the relationship between peace and justice context of 1325? Very often states persuade victims and survivors to sacrifice justice for the sake of maintaining peace, yet everlasting peace is difficult or impossible without justice. So how do we see this particular, how do we see, how do we see this particular dilemma from the perspective of 1325? So this is a second question to Professor Asha Hans. There is a third question, which is in the discussion related to gender-based violence. Male victims of sexualized violence are often left out, and which even 1325 failed to address, and this sustains a male perpetrator and female victim paradigm. How do you think the mandate of 1325 be extended or upgraded to address the issues related to male victims? So these are the three questions to Professor Asha Hans. There's a question that's directed to me. I haven't had time to look at it. I will read it shortly, and we hope that by the time Professor Asha Hans responds to these questions, there will be some questions which will be posed here to Professor Oishik Sircar. So, Professor Asha Hans.
Thank you, Saumya, and thank you for the questions. In fact, 1325 was meant for people like refugees, whether they are Rohingyas or whether it's an ethnic crisis in Sri Lanka or what is happening in Kashmir. It was meant for that. But if countries like Sri Lanka and India don't agree to 1325, then that is why we are saying that we need to shift off from only a state-centric kind of resolution that we looked at. Initially, it went to the Security Council because where the Security Council is concerned, they are the people in charge of security. Some people in India have been civil society members, have been saying that it should have gone to the General Assembly. But those who wrote 1325 and helped in writing said that where General Assembly is concerned, usually it is talk and there is very little action that they can take. But where refugees are concerned, they were always a part of that dialogue. They were always a part of what 1325 was supposed to do. If you have to have participation, you have to have protection, you also have to have prevention. The major idea was that prevention should be there, that you don't let these situations come about. What is happening in Myanmar, or whether refugees are here in India, whether Rohingyas are concerned, or in Bangladesh, the first thing is that is what they said, that don't let war come in. That is where you have to stop. And then comes the issue of protection, and then comes the issue of participation. But where this was concerned, most countries have not agreed to it, because where issues of peace and security are concerned, or national security as they are concerned, unless we don't move away from that paradise, and this also answers particularly also your question, Saumya, that we have to move away from that paradigm. We have to at least talk. Lots of people have been talking about it. But women are saying that where we are concerned, whether we come as refugees, whether we are mothers in Sri Lanka or in Kashmir or in the Northeast, it is, you have to give us that peace, that security that we have been demanding. And where violence is concerned, the amount of violence that takes place in any kind of situation, most of these refugees need a lot of what comes under the fourth pillar of 1325, that is relief and recovery. That should be coming from there. So it does provide for refugees in a large way. And it has been used in Bosnia, it has been used in Liberia, where refugees were concerned, ethnic conflict was concerned. In fact, the reason why 1325 came was because of the ethnic issues in Bosnia and what happened in Rwanda. So it was meant to target that. So that is there. And where justice is concerned, the major aim, I think, of 1325 is justice. How do women get justice? If the state does not recognize, if the powers that we do not recognize that women are being affected, you have to prevent war. It's not only after you have a war that you come and protect them, that they are being killed or massacred or that they are sex slaves, whatever is happening. It should not be allowed to happen. And one of the ways is through participation. Justice can only come if people participate. And I think this is a major goal of 1325, which people have not been able to implement properly, because that is where you want women on the table, whether it is in the peacekeeping negotiations as going on in Afghanistan, or it is in your own municipality. You have to be there, and that is where justice comes. The third one on men and boys, there are two new resolutions which are come with 1325, which deals with men and boys, because we people have not only recognized that men and boys are victims, but also that they are not only perpetrators but they are also victims. So both these have been identified in the other resolution. In 1325, at a time when it came into being, when Bosnia and Rwanda was taking place, it was usually men who were the perpetrators. There was a lot of problems at that time. And there was, I think, also little recognition of the fact that men were also suffering. It was later that people came in and women came in and said, okay, we also need to look at that, because a lot of boys, soldiers, if you remember two issues that went to the Security Council when Al Gore took the environment security to the Security Council, and there was one on child soldiers. So, there were issues that were also going to the Security Council, which were like this, where women are saying, oh, soft issue, that what people would call a soft issue, that they did go there. But what women are asking, let us decide. We are the decision makers. Don't keep us out of decision making. I think that is what is very important. I hope that answers a part of what, I know it cannot answer fully, but maybe part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Asha Hans. There is one more question for you. I'm just reading this out, maybe a brief answer from you while we are still waiting for some questions for Professor Oishik Sircar. The question to you is from Nivedita Ray, and she says that it has been 20 years now since the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, but the progress has been underwhelming. It has been critiqued for not living up to its mandate because it has no teeth and accountability mechanism. Your comments on this?
I think to a large extent you are right that 1325 has not lived up to its expectations, because states who adopted it, 86 states who adopted it, did not look at prevention at all. That was not something that came in their mandate. So if you are not going to attack war, the system of war itself, then everything follows from there. So the question of accountability, how does it come up when people don't even agree to prevention? That is the minimum of all these four pillars that the nation state look at. And that is why I think that there are now indicators, of course, of where monitoring and evaluation are concerned have come up. Nation states have adopted them. But what has happened is with 1325 is many of the states who don't have conflict or never had conflict have adopted it. Those states who have ongoing conflicts are still wary to adopt it. I don't know whether it has something to do with the issues being brought up, like in the Arya formula, because if you remember, the Arya formula was the one that brought in 1325, and that is where civil society can go to the Security Council and discuss. I think that has been one way of auditing what is going on, but many states will not agree to 1325. I think one of the reasons is that Arya formula can come in. I think that is something we need to look at. Thank you.
Ma'am, I think Dr. Sircar can answer the question from Dr. Sanjeev Kumar.
Yes.
Many times there is a
Yes,
disconnect.
yes. I'm reading it out. Yeah, thank you. So there is one question which has been asked to any speaker. So maybe that's a question which Professor Oishik Sircar can answer. Many times there is a disconnect between theoretical definitions or a particular understanding of feminism and definitions that are used by governments. So how would you see this kind of a disconnect, and how would you comment on this disconnect?
Thank you for the question. I think the idea of a disconnect works as a common sense. There'll always be a disconnect between people who are not in conversation. But I wouldn't want to characterize this as a disconnect between, if I'm reading your question or query correctly, I wouldn't want to read it as a disconnect between theory and practice. Because that disconnect necessarily would mean that theorizing is something that is done by academics and practice is something that is done by activists or those who are in the ground, in the trenches, as it were. And I think that is an unhelpful way to think about the relationship between theory and practice. It also, I think, that way of distancing theory and practice performs a particular kind of hierarchization between theory being something that is the work of the mind, practice is something that is the work of the body. So it kind of repeats a certain kind of mind-body dichotomy if one starts to think about theory and practice in that way. I would think, and there's a huge amount of feminist work out there which has tried to unsettle this clean distinction between theory and practice. And I think those who are working at the ground level theorize as much as those who sit in university spaces theorize. For me, very simply put, and this is a question that I have, this is a comment that I have to make every time I teach the subject that I teach, which is jurisprudence, otherwise called philosophy of law or legal theory, because there is a theory aversion amongst law students. They generally tend to think that theory wouldn't get them good jobs. And for me, simply put, theory is a shared language of communication, and any kind of shared language of communication develops in a particular context. And theory is not necessarily divorced from a commitment to empiricism. So, in an illustration that I use, and I don't mean to be flippant when I use this in illustration, but it works well in my classes, is to, for example, and young people, I guess, take it on particularly well, is that if they've gone to a party and the next day they come back and share with their fellow students and say the party was really cool, right? Nobody will say that their expression is theoretically absurd. That's because they didn't touch the party or measure its temperature to then say that it was cool. But cool is a language of communication, right? That has a particular context in which it makes perfect sense. It might not make any sense in another context. So for me, theorization is about being able to work with concepts that emerge in a particular context. And when that context, through usage over a period of time, gain a certain kind of shared currency. And of course, that language is dynamic. A concept that emerged in a particular context needn't necessarily remain one, over a period of time. So for example, I'm just reminded of a comment that Saumya made with regard to governance feminism. It's a word or it's a term that's being used currently to describe a certain kind of phenomena. But does that mean practices akin to governance feminism didn't exist earlier? It's just that there wasn't a word that was used to describe it. So I think moments and situations produce opportunities for language to gain a certain kind of currency, and that is what I would, at the very kind of elementary level, understand what theory is. So I think activists theorize as much as academics do, and so I don't necessarily see that as a binary at all. I don't know whether that answers your question, though, but.
Just add on a little bit to what Oishik was saying, because the question is also about disconnect between theoretical definitions by feminism and the definitions used by governments. So maybe not definitions used by governments, but I could, for example, give an example of how there is a difference between how feminists, for example, would look at the institution of marriage or institution of family and how governments would look at it. And coming from a legal perspective, I see that whether it is in the Family Courts Act or in many other laws that are meant to protect women, there is this understanding by the government that home is a safe place for women, and that marriage is an institution that needs to be protected at all cost, at the cost of women's lives, at the cost of women's dignity, safety, security, mental health, everything. It is the institution of marriage that needs to be protected. And yet, as far as feminists are concerned, there's a very clear critique of marriage as an institution, of family as an institution, and the fact that women are not safe either within the homes or outside in that sense. So I think that is a place where I see this difference, I see this dilemma, there is a tension, and that tension plays out in terms of judgments, that tension plays out in terms of campaigns for law reform, and in the whole legal advocacy as well. One other question which was directed to me by Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, I would like to respond to that question and also connect with something that Professor Oishik Sircar said earlier. The question is, you termed human rights conditions of women in India as dismal. How do you see the role of civil society in this context? Do you think these organizations have potential to play a more effective role in India? Thank you for this question. Having worked with civil society organizations as a feminist activist, law researcher for over 20 years before I stepped into formal academia in a full-time basis, I really am able to relate to the question that you have asked. Definitely, civil society organizations have a lot to play in terms of, they work at various levels, at the ground level in terms of providing socio-legal assistance to actually even complain or report a violation, to taking the woman, hand-holding her through the entire process of justice, whether through the formal court process or through a more informal or a quasi-judicial process. Also, I think women's organizations and civil society groups have a lot to play in terms of policy formulation and influencing the kind of legal amendments, amendments in law, amendments in policy, and also through public interest litigation, taking cases up to the courts. Although PILs have, I'm conscious of the kind of critique of PILs that have come in now, but PILs have been a useful weapon for women's groups to take up social issues to the court. So Vishaka judgment, which gave certain guidelines for sexual harassment at workplace, came up through a PIL. So in that sense, I think civil society organizations have a lot to play, but we must remember that in the present political context that we are in, there is the civic space and the democratic space is shrinking, and it is shrinking very, very rapidly. And we see the new FCRA regulations which have come in, which are actually clipping the wings of the civil society organizations, and they are making it more and more difficult for such civil society organizations to function and to actually provide any kind of assistance or guidance to women whose human rights have been violated. But where I want to also connect this with what Oishik was saying earlier is something very interesting that you were saying, that theory is derived as much from grassroots as from academics. So I agree totally with that. And the reverse is also true, that academics also bring in a certain level of activism, and it is really not theory and activism as two separate things in that sense. Even within the women's movements, there has been a very, very rich discourse between the academia, which is women's studies, and the women's movements in terms of the activism itself. And I think Professor Vibhuti Patel is here, who can speak much more about it, about this aspect. There are just two other things that, since we are almost it's time to end. There's just one thing I want to respond to what Oishik was saying earlier about how sexuality kept getting bracketed. And from my own experience in terms of the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court, which established the International Criminal Court, and we had huge delegations of women's organizations from all over the world, which were trying to influence this whole process and bring in certain human rights standards related to women into this International Criminal Court statute when it was made. Even there, gender kept getting bracketed, and finally, because of Holy See and the alliance between Holy See and some of the other Arab countries, we actually had gender put in, with an asterisk saying that gender connotes male and female and nothing more. So something like that. So both gender and sexuality in that sense have been very, very contentious across the international human rights spaces. The only other thing when I think of double bind is the latest advertisement of Tanishq, which on which there is so much of a discussion since yesterday, day before yesterday, the whole thing of Tanishq pulling out that advertisement of this interreligious marriage and this god bharai and all of that. So at one level, what it is showing is this happy interreligious marriage where the customs and religious traditions are all respected between the two families and so on. But at the other level, it is also celebrating women's, god barai, which for feminism, it is a very, very uneasy thing, because you're looking at, celebrating women only in terms of their reproductive rights and giving value to women through their reproductive rights. And there is a question of women's agency in that whole advertisement as well. So it is a double bind in that sense, for the women's movements and for feminists as well. I don't think we have, I think there are a few more questions, but I don't think we have any time, because the next session starts in 10 to 15 minutes. So I think we will need to end this session here. So thank you to both the very eminent speakers, and thank you to all the participants for raising the questions. And thank you to the organizers. Over to you, Ankita.
Thank you, Dr. Uma, for chairing the session. And I would also like to thank our participants for their wonderful presentations. Now we will take a short break and we'll join back at 15:45 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.